This is Principles of Management, Chapter 8, Organizational Control and Change. We talked about controlling previously when managers are going to have the oversight to make sure that their subordinates are doing what they're supposed to be doing. That kind of extends to the organization as a whole. So the individual subordinate control process kind of expands out where you make sure that a group of employees or teams or project teams or divisions or entire units or geographic areas are all performing at the level that they're supposed to. So the level of control the managers have, it just basically allows them to have feedback loops so that they can monitor what's going on and regulate efficiency and effectiveness to make sure that we are able to achieve the mission of the organization. A control system is an established process that's in place so the managers can actually go through, look at the goals that are set, look at how well the targets are being met, monitor performance, whether at the individual or unit level, and then evaluate the performance that's going on at a higher level, typically at the unit level or as a project group level. Control systems are often incorporated through applications online, through an intranet or in the cloud. Typically what an HR department would have or a managerial department would have is some type of a control system where you do evaluations of employees and then you step it up to evaluations of entire product lines or services that are being provided, evaluations of how well a particular group is doing, a business function. And a lot of that can be detailed online so that that data can be collected and presented in a dashboard online so that the information would be readily available for managers to be able to review. In order to make decisions, as we talked about earlier with critical thinking and decision making, you need to have data. So what a control system does is it collects the data and puts it in a position where a manager can have access to it and then make an informed decision. A good control system has to be flexible so that you can respond as needed, be able to get the information right away. Typically, that can be done if it's kept online or in the cloud. The control system should also provide accurate information. So I think we mentioned before, whenever you're making a decision on the basis of data, the decision is only going to be as good as the data and as good as that data has been interpreted. If you have bad data or if you interpret it incorrectly, the decision that you make and the conclusion that you draw from it will be incorrect. So in order to have a good assessment or a good decision that's going to be made, you have to make sure that the information being collected is the correct information, that it's accurate, and that it's being interpreted correctly. The other thing is the system needs to have timeliness. It has to have timeliness built into it. So you should have a regular collection of information that's done and inputted into the system so that it can be populating the dashboard so that managers could have close to real-time information about certain areas. Some things maybe don't require it to be that quickly. It could be a weekly or a monthly review, but in certain things, especially in manufacturing, where you're looking at volume, you need to have feedback very quickly so that the control systems have to be timely so that if there's a problem, you can react to it quickly before you start losing money and customers. There are three types of control: at the input stage, at the conversion stage, and at the output stage. So if you think of a company, let's say a manufacturer, the input stage is at the beginning of any process. You get raw materials. The conversion stage is you taking the raw materials, adding value to it, and then the output stage is the finished product. That can be in a service provision as well. You have some type of information that has to be processed. You convert it into whatever it is that you're going to be selling to your end user, your consumers, and then the output stage is the service that you're putting out. So at the input stage, we're looking at feed-forward control. At the conversion stage, we're looking at concurrent control. And then at the output stage, we're looking at feedback control. Feed-forward control is just something that allows managers to anticipate problems before they arise. If you go through proper planning channels and you get a good idea about how things should be processed and you have standards and operations and policies in place, as we've discussed earlier, having a thorough analysis of that ahead of time, thinking through what types of things could potentially go wrong, how would we identify if those things were going wrong, then you can identify the type of material and the type of information that you need to be able to collect in order to make that assessment. So at the feed-forward control, you're basically coming up with an idea of what type of information you need to get collected in order to identify things quickly so that you can avoid problems or at least control them before they become uncontrollable. If you have good feed-forward controls in place, you can give information and direction to your subordinates and production or service units so that they can respond to them and correct any problems before they become really a bigger issue. Concurrent control is something that gives you immediate feedback on how efficiently all of the inputs that we're looking at are being transformed into the outputs. So if we're a manufacturer, we're getting raw materials, how efficiently we are adding value through the manufacturing process, what type of quality are we getting in the outputs so that we can make sure that our consumers will be satisfied. The final type of control is feedback control. That's something where you basically follow up on how well something is done. It's a way to evaluate the process after it's complete so that managers can make a determination as to whether or not anything needs to change in the process, whether it be input or concurrent control. You can get feedback from customers, from other clients, people who are buying your product. Oftentimes, whenever you buy something from a company, you'll get a telephone call back or you'll get an email or a text that says, hey, we'd really like to know how well we did. That's one way of getting feedback control. It can be kind of difficult to acquire, and that's why people bug their consumers, their customers, so frequently trying to get this information. Once that information is collected, it can be put into the control system and evaluated by the managers through access to a dashboard. The next slide shows the 4 steps in organizational control. Step 1 is when you establish the standards that you want to measure, the targets that you're trying to achieve, and then you will then follow through by actually measuring the performance, comparing the performance against what you think you should be achieving, and the last part is to evaluate the result and initiate any type of corrective action. So it's essentially a recursive process. So if you decided in the planning stage, for example, that you came up with these standards of performance, and then after you went through all 4 steps, you decided that the standards that you had chosen and the targets that you had either weren't correct or they weren't feasible, you could go back and change it again so that as you go through the process, you become more adept, the process evolves, and hopefully it becomes more efficient through repetition. There are 3 types of organizational control systems. We'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail in upcoming slides. The type of control is output control. This is basically what you're producing either in terms of products or services. You can measure them by financial measurements, comparing it to organizational goals, and comparing it to your operating budgets. When you make a budget in the future, you're just trying to figure out how much money something should cost. Whether or not you can achieve the efficiency necessary to come in under budget is what's being measured here. Behavioral control, that goes from direct supervision, management by objectives, and rules and standard operating procedures, which we'll get to in a bit. And then the last piece is organizational culture or clan control. And that goes to norms, values, and socialization, the way people respond when they work in a particular organization and the culture of that organization and how that could potentially have an impact on the way people behave and act. The first thing that we're going to talk about under output control is the way to measure it. And one of the ways to do that is to measure financial performance. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail here. When you guys take accounting, or if you have taken an accounting class, you'll understand all the different ratios that are available. These are very just basic measurements of financial performance. A ratio is simply a statement of a fraction. So you divide one number into the other, and that results in some type of a percentage, or you can write it as a ratio or as a percentage. So a profit ratio is basically a return on investment or an ROI measurement. If you're putting money into a company, how much of a return on their investment are you getting? If I invest $100 and I get $110 back, I have a 10% profit. So I have a 10% return on my investment. A liquidity ratio measures how much money you actually have in terms of resources for short-term debt, which can be readily converted back into cash. You can do that through 2 different ways of doing it, the current and quick ratios. If you want to look at return on investment at the bottom of this slide, again, because it's a ratio, it's essentially a fraction. So you look at the net profit before taxes and you look at your total assets. The total assets represent all of the money that's been invested in the company. The net profit is how much money those assets are producing. That number, or that percentage, will be your return on investment. Gross profit margin, you take sales revenues minus the cost of goods sold. So there's your profit. And then you put that over sales revenues. Current ratio is current assets over current liabilities, and the quick ratio is current assets less inventory over current liabilities. The liability is money that you owe. Again, it's not the purpose of this class to go into the ratios, but you just need to know that there are literally dozens of ratios. When I took my accounting exams, we used to have the formulas for all the ratios, and we would have to apply the appropriate one in the questions for the exam. So this is not that type of class. We're not going to be testing you on that, but you should know that there are these types of ratios that your accountant team would usually go through, but a manager of any kind can do these if they have access to the data to be able to plug in the formula correctly. A leverage ratio refers to how much debt or equity a company is using to finance operations. Leverage is really kind of a force magnifier. If I'm trying to pick something up, it's heavy. If I get literally a lever and a fulcrum, I can use leverage to lift it up, so I can lift a lot more weight using a tool. Leverage for a financial interest is when I borrow money. If I only have $100,000 to put into my company and I use that, but I also borrow another $200,000, now I've got $300,000. So the idea of borrowing money, which is a liability, otherwise known as debt, and I combine that with my equity, that increases my capacity for investment. So that's why they refer to sometimes debt when you borrow money as leverage. You may have heard the term leveraged buyout. That means you're buying another company by taking out a loan in order to finance the purchase. So what a leverage ratio is that you don't want to be so far in debt that it's going to be hard to service that debt and get loans and be able to do other things. You want to have a profit that's left over that you can put in your pocket and pay to your shareholders. You don't want to have all of your profits going to pay off interest on your debt. So a leverage ratio is a good way to be able to take care of that. Activity ratios also talks about how quickly you turn over your inventory. If you have inventory that's lying around for a long period of time compared to other benchmarks and metrics that you want to be looking at, then that could mean that you're not selling enough stuff or you're manufacturing too much stuff in advance. And that usually results in less efficiency. When you sink money into a product and it's just sitting on a shelf rather than putting money back into your pocket or earning some type of a return, then you're not acting in a particularly efficient way. Leverage ratios and activity ratios can be used to be able to make sure that you're not borrowing too much money, and that if you are especially a manufacturer of products or you're selling products, that you're not going to have things lying on the shelf too long, so that you would not be able to get the benefit of putting that money to work for you instead of having a finished product that you paid for sitting on a shelf. So the debt to asset ratio is explained here. You look at total debt into total assets. You look at the times covered ratio, where you take the profit, you take the numerator, which is the profit before interest and taxes, and divide it into the denominator, total interest. Inventory turnover is the cost of goods sold over inventory, and the days of sales outstanding, that's another turnover inventory type of calculation. When you're setting organizational goals, we kind of touched upon this a little bit before when we were talking about management for individuals. You should give people tasks that are challenging, something that they can attain, but something that's not totally within their comfort zone. The idea behind that is if you have a specific goal, there's not going to be any ambiguity. People are going to understand exactly what they're trying to get. And it's not going to be something that they can just sit back and put their feet up on their desk and be able to accomplish it. They're going to have to do a little bit of work. It can't be something that either is limited by resources and time or capabilities, that it's going to be perceived as being impossible, because then when people become overwhelmed, they typically shut down and don't do work. But if it's something that's challenging, people like to do puzzles, people like to be engaged, people like to come up with solutions to things. If you can get the proper combination of being specific and difficult, people tend to respond quite well to it. Stretch goals, they go a little bit beyond what the norm is. It may be that you're trying to see if you can come up with a new product, if you can come up with a solution within a quicker period of time than you're usually expecting. So you can do a stretch goal, which is, I wouldn't do stretch goals all the time. When the time is right and it's appropriate, because either urgency of a particular situation requires it, or you're just trying to shake things up, you can implement some stretch goals. If you do stretch goals over and over again, you'll start to burn your staff out. Organization-wide goal setting consists of corporate level managers trying to figure out what their divisions are going to do. Then at the middle level, you get your division managers figuring out what the functions are going to be. And then at the lower level, the frontline functional managers set the goal for the workers and the tasks that they have to do to be able to accomplish the goals of the organization. An operating budget is essentially a plan to tell managers how they should be spending their money and their resources in order to control the organization. The budget, by definition, is kind of a prediction about what you're going to need going forward. It should probably be based, ideally, on what you did before, any strategies and any new things that you're trying to do. If you're cutting back, your budget will probably drop. If you're trying to do something new, your budget should be estimated out. Typically, budgets are corrected during the course of the year. If they're not accurate and it turns out that things are more expensive than you thought they would be, you need to do a budget adjustment. But by having a budget, by having an assessment as to how much money you should be spending to accomplish a particular goal, it keeps you within the parameters that you're supposed to be working within. We talked about effectiveness and efficiency. Efficiency is accomplishing objectives with the least amount of expenditure of resources. I can probably get a lot of things done if I have an unlimited supply of money. I wouldn't be particularly profitable if that was the case, though. I'd be spending all of my profits just to get the job done. When you have a budget and you ask your managers to stick to it, provided that they're adequately designed and reasonable budgets, then what you're doing is you're giving an incentive to managers and the employees that work for them to come up with ways and processes to become more efficient. Because if you know that you have to get this job done and you know that you have a certain amount of money with which to be able to perform that objective, then you will have to come up with some new operational plans and means by which to be able to get those goals done without spending too much money. It is a way to encourage higher levels of productivity and efficiency. Typically, lower level managers are really charged with being able to get the job done within a particular amount of money that's been budgeted. Under operating budgets, there are basically three components that we look at for effective output control. Number one is objective financial measures. Objective, we talked about the difference between objective and subjective in critical thinking. Objective is essentially fact-based, whereas subjective would be opinion-based. So these are hard data, real factual information that you can use to measure output. You want to have challenging goals and performance standards, as we've talked about previously, and you have to have appropriate operating budgets. So if you are very skilled at what you're doing, you're going to have some financial measures. You're going to try to figure out what you can accomplish within the constraints of those financial measures and create operational budgets and then charge your managers and their employees to be able to perform all of the tasks and goals and objectives that you have within that budget so that you can hopefully at the end of the year, if you perform within your budget and you bring in the revenues that you were expecting, you'll be able to increase your profit margin. Problems with output control are typically based on situations in which managers have chosen to measure certain things that maybe don't encourage employees to do the type of work that is required to accomplish what you've set out to do. For example, you create an output control where you want to make sure that you produce 100 of these particular types of product where you used to produce 75. You're asking for a 33% increase in output. What that does is that metric tells the employees that the most important thing is making the product and getting as many of them created as possible. What they could end up doing, though, is in order to increase the output, they could actually cut back on quality. And if your customers are buying this product, it's in demand, so you need more of them, but they're not working particularly well because you've not measured the right thing or you haven't ensured quality is kept consistent when you increase the amount of output, then the incentive may not match what you're actually trying to achieve. So sometimes the standards that you create could result in behavior that would not be appropriate to achieve the goals that you're setting out to accomplish. Behavior control refers directly to employees. So this is that controlling function that we were talking about before. The most basic type is direct supervision. You monitor, you watch the employees, you interact with them, you teach them what's going on, you get them the training that they need. And then when there's something that goes right, you encourage them, you give them a pat on the back and tell them to keep doing it so that you can have that type of behavior emulated and repeated in the future. If they're not doing something that they should be doing, you should institute some form of corrective action. That could result in some additional training or potentially even punishment if it's some type of bad outcome. Typically, you don't go with the negative consequences and punishment unless it's something that would be grievously wrong. Most managers try to hold back on taking sanctions against their employees unless they're doing things like sexual harassment and other problematic behaviors that need to be halted immediately. Another form of behavioral control is management by objectives. So this is basically where you're setting objectives, which are goals, so that you're trying to achieve, and then you measure the subordinate's ability to perform and accomplish those goals. Management by objectives has basically three component parts. Number one, you want to have the specific goals, and again, they should be challenging, that are established for each level of the organization, lower level, medium, and even at the corporate level. Managers and the subordinates together should figure out what the subordinate goals are. Often that allows some level of empowerment. I've said before, managers don't necessarily always know what's going on in the day-to-day function of their employees. So when you sit down with your employees and you talk to them about what one employee thinks is a reasonable objective, and then another employee may have a different level, when you talk to 20 or 30 employees, you get a pretty good idea of what they're capable of. Then you can really come up with the type of goal that you think should be appropriate for the entire group of people. The next thing is for the managers and the subordinates to take a look at how well each employee is doing. Typically, what people do is they have a quarterly evaluation process where you sit down and you take a look at the goals that were set forth at the beginning of the period of time. The first period is to see how well we're doing, do a progress report. The next one would be to actually look at some data to see how they're doing. And then the third and fourth would be to close out, ensure that the employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And you can take some steps for corrective action along the way as appropriate. Behavior control, one of the things that you can also use is bureaucratic control. A bureaucracy is basically a complicated system that's been instituted to be able to control the decision-making process. If you have a bureaucracy where you have to file a request in triplicate, and it has to go to a particular department or a particular supervisor has to look at it, they have to submit it up the ladder for approval, it does allow a very high level of control. Now, as we talked about in a previous chapter, bureaucracy or bureaucratic tendencies also appear most commonly in tall organizations where you have a lot of layers of management that could impede potentially the ability to make a decision in a quick and responsive manner. Some of the problems with bureaucratic control is that you lose the flexibility, you don't really get creative problem solving, you don't get really quick reaction time in order to get something done, because instead of an employee seeing a problem and then taking action to correct it, they have to go and ask permission and follow this established process that can take time. Now, depending on the nature of what's going on, it may be the type of decision that really does require that, because you wouldn't want one person or maybe a lower level person making a decision that could have a big impact. So sometimes bureaucratic controls are important, but if you are overly bureaucratic, then you can kind of stunt the ability for the organization to behave in a reactive and effective, efficient manner. The other problem is that when people are instituted into a bureaucratic system, they tend to just follow the system. They're more of a form over function. They really are striving to, make sure the paperwork is filed and the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed instead of making sure that the job gets done. So you end up with this bureaucratic red tape scenario where sometimes the reaction times are extended and you don't really get that resolution as quickly as you might like. Organizational culture is very similar to culture that applies to different groups of people, whether it be by religion or country or community. Typically, when you have a group of people that are isolated, they tend to come up with their own standards and more norms that they follow. So if you're in the United States, the people in the Northeast are probably have their own culture that's a little bit different, and it's predicated on things that have been here. It's the oldest part of the country. It's cold. The way people behave, the way they operate, the way they act is much different than, say, in the Midwest, because they grew up in a different set of circumstances with a different group of people. Organizations are the same thing. When you have an organization that is insular and you've got a group of people that are working there and they are working under a particular form of rules that were established by the founders, that can really have an impact on the organization. If an organization feels that they should be creative and they encourage creativity and they encourage their workers to speak up, you may become familiar with that type of culture, and then you go work in another company and they may not follow that and you may appear to be somewhat out of place. If you have a good, strong organizational culture, I always tell my students it's an advantage for managers, because sometimes complying with the culture controls some of the behaviors of your employees so that they don't require quite as much management. When we talk about cultural norms, imagine if you're going to see the symphony. You would dress a certain way. You would applaud when you're supposed to. You wouldn't make noise in between. If you went to a rock concert or you went to a disco or whatever, the way you behave, the way you dress, the way you interact with people, the way you talk is dictated by the nature, by the culture of that environment that you're in. If you have a good, strong organizational culture that's high in ethics and learning and things like that, where people are able to help each other, it makes it a lot easier for the organization to be successful, and it relieves some of the burden for the managers to constantly have to be worried about controlling, because the culture of it, almost like a peer pressure type of system, starts to help you regulate and manage the control function of your employees. A clan is a close-knit group of families that are tied together in terms of the way that they act and the way that they behave. It's just an offshoot of the concept of organizational culture. If you have behaviors that are expected, your employees will typically act within the clan, the group of people that they have within the organization, and that can help put them in the right direction. There'll be pressure on them to do the right thing. I said before, if you have the right type of culture, it makes your life as a manager easier. You could also be in an organization that has a bad organizational culture, one that is maybe not quite so ethical, one that is not really inventive or creative or gives empowerment to the employees. You may have a culture that kind of represses the ability of your employees to stand up and take action. That actually requires more work from managers. So if you have a good, effective culture in place, the command control can kind of tacitly dictate the behavior of your employees so that they're doing the things that they should be in order to be more successful. Adaptive cultures and inert cultures, there's an old saying, if you don't adapt, you die. That's the idea behind evolution. Things are always changing. If you don't change with the times, then you're going to be left behind. So an adaptive culture is simply an organizational culture that is built inherently to help move forward, to change when it needs to respond to any environmental changes from within or without, so that you can remain competitive in the marketplace. If you think about the term inert, maybe if you think about medicine, there are active ingredients and there are inert ingredients. The active ingredients causes the effect that you're looking for. If you're taking aspirin, there are active ingredients that'll help your headache go away. The inert ingredients are just filler to keep everything bound together, but they don't actually do anything. An inert culture is essentially a culture that does not adapt. You establish norms and values, but they don't continue to inspire employees because they may be antiquated, and it can lead to stagnation. The last couple of slides in this chapter concern organizational control and change. The slide here has a graphic that just shows the balancing act. You need to improve operations, but you also need to respond to new events. To improve operations, you're setting up policies and standard operating guidelines for the people to follow. You have to establish them, cement them into place so that people can follow them. But the problem is you have to be able to adapt when change takes place. So it's constantly balancing this out. You don't want to be constantly changing so that nobody has any grounding. They don't have any sense of where they're supposed to be going. They need to be rooted in something. So it's creating a good system that is capable of being updated on the fly incrementally so that you can respond to new events without throwing out the entire process before and starting over from scratch. No, organizational change is when you've decided that you need to make some change. There's always going to be some level of change at every level of the organization if it's a healthy organization, because as I said, the environment is very frequently changing. Technology changes, your competitors change, consumer tastes change, the needs change. You have to be able to change with it. Organizational change of this magnitude, though, for what we're talking about now, is when the company or the organization really needs to restructure everything that it's doing. It could go back to the organizational design. Maybe things have changed so much that you actually need to redesign the strategy of the way that you set things up, whether by function or product or geography, for example. This would be an organization or enterprise-wide change that you would try to increase effectiveness and efficiency because you are not able to keep up with the standards. 4 steps in the organizational change process. The first thing is never do anything that you don't need to do. So you have to assess the need to change. Is there a problem? If there is, identify what the source of the problem, diagnose it. Once you understand what the source of the problem is, then you can start evaluating what types of changes would work. This goes back to critical thinking in Chapter 5 with decision making. So you want to come up with a few alternative possible solutions, and then maybe through a group decision, have a committee put together, try to figure out which one actually makes the most sense. Then it comes time to implement the change. You have to roll it out, educate people, train them on it. Ideally, you would be communicating with a staff that's going to be facing this change so that they're not going to be taken by surprise and they can buy into it rather than resist to the change and feel like it's being thrust upon them. Ideally, through that communication process, you'll get information from people about what types of changes could be beneficial, and they can contribute to the change so that when it comes, it's something that they've already been aware of, and they may even welcome it because it's something that they've asked for. Once the change is implemented, you want to evaluate the change. Take a look at where you were before, take a look at where you are now, and find out if the delta, the beginning state and the end state, is where you actually want to be. One of the aspects in change is that you have to be able to get your personnel, your subordinates, and all of the staff in the organization to buy in. And as I said, that happens through communication, but you have to be able to unfreeze the current state. You've taken time to put together the operational procedures, you've established it, people follow it. Now you have to get them to understand that what we're doing is not optimal. So in order to change it, you have to explain why that change is happening. If it's a rational, understood, easily grasped change, people will figure out why you're doing it, and they will hopefully grab onto it. So that would unfreeze the current situation, make it so that you can go to the new process and then lock that process in place or refreeze it once it's in place. That way you can make sure that the change actually takes effect. A lot of places, and many of you who have had jobs, you've seen your boss come in and say, we're going to do something different. They take a couple of missteps, it doesn't really work, and then they just give up. That's not efficient and effective change. You want to be able to make sure that you put it into place, you kind of police it, you have controlling activities to make sure that people are following through on the new procedures that you've established, and then you can go ahead and do the evaluation. They also mentioned benchmarking when you're doing the evaluation of the change. Benchmark is a term that comes from surveying. Surveying is simply measuring land. So you would go out with your surveying equipment and you would put your equipment on literally a bench and you would make a mark in it so that when you measured it, you would put it down in one position. And then if you have to remeasure it, you would put it in exactly the same thing. Colloquially, it's become known as a way to compare yourself or your organization to the performance of other organizations. You would compare your sales to one of your competitors' levels of sales, the way that you do certain processes to the way that others do those types of processes to see where you measure up. Organizational learning is very important. I mentioned when you go through the 4 steps, after you've decided what change to make, you want to implement the change, you need to educate your staff. You need to let them know what they need to do in order to understand what the new conditions are going to be and how to have them implemented. Also understand why we're making this change. What is the impetus for the change? If people just see change for the sake of changing things, they're not going to be that happy with it. We used to get, updated software packages. All they would do is change the buttons along the top. Was there really any reason for it? If it's just change for the sake of doing change, people aren't going to be that enamored with it. If there's change that's actually going to have an outcome that is desirable, and you can explain to people why it's desirable, then it would be much more likely that they would embrace the change. And then through the implementation, they would start to make it part of their routine and make it a permanent shift. You can have top-down change, which is what you have to do in an emergency, basically. Top-down is not really the greatest way to get empowerment and buy-in from your staff because it's just basically management saying you have to do this and you have to do it right now. If there was an emergency that popped up, if there was some type of financial outcome that we are not happy with and we need to do something quickly, it's basically a fast, so-called revolutionary change, and it can really help things move quickly. You have to be careful not to let things fall through the cracks because speed is good, but if speed is done at the sacrifice of ability or capability because it's going too quickly, it's not going to work particularly well. Bottom-up change is when you talk to the workers who are doing it, try to get their input a little bit more. You can take your time when it's not an emergency, and it's more of an evolutionary change. So you can talk to people, get their input. It doesn't necessarily have to be immediate because we're not going to go bankrupt if we don't implement these changes right away, but it can make us a better organization going forward. So typically the top down is what you need to do when it's quick, and the bottom up is what you do if you have the time to implement some other changes that would be effective. We already talked about benchmarking, so this slide is just basically covering that. It's really measuring how well you're doing against your peers in the market. And that's the end of Chapter 8.